Hello, everyone. This is Dale Bowen with the Public Technology Institute. I would like to welcome you to this webinar, Ask the Executive Directors. NASCIO and PTI address the state and local government technology landscape. Have a question on state and local government technology issues? Well, here's your opportunity to ask Doug Robinson, Executive Director of NASCIO, and Alan Shark, Executive Director of PTI, what they are seeing with regards to the latest in the state and local government technology community. Over the past few weeks, we have invited registrants to send us their questions. We will kick off the discussion with some of those questions, but throughout the webinar, if you have something that you would like to ask of Doug and Alan, please type it in the question box that you should see on the control panel on your monitor. We also have a couple of quick poll topics that we will present during the webinar. The discussion is being recorded, and a link to the recording will be provided by NASCIO. So now I'd like to introduce Doug Robinson of NASCIO, who will begin with a short presentation to be followed by Alan Shark of PTI, and then we will get the discussion going. Doug?
Dale, thank you very much, and welcome everyone to our webinar this afternoon. This webinar is going to be more conversational and informal because we are going to address several dozen questions that we received prior to the start of the webinar today via our registration process. First of all, we've got a couple of quick polls, one about cybersecurity and one about IT modernization. So if all of our attendees will take just a few seconds and answer the polls, we will address those as we go along this afternoon. So again, take a few seconds and address our poll about cybersecurity, and then we'll move to the second one. All right, very good. We will address these. I'm equally concerned. We'll talk about these when we get to the section on cybersecurity, which Alan and I will both talk about from the state and local perspective. So let's go to the second question. Again, we're having a little bit of fun on IT modernization. Give us your perspective from your organizational view about which automaker equates with your current IT infrastructure. All right, Danielle, let's go ahead and close the poll so we can move on. Very good, very interesting. Reliable and hadn't have any problems. Okay, well that's promising. That's promising. All right, I'm going to start out talking a little bit about the State Cio Priorities for 2019, and I'm going to go via video now. So you can see our palatial headquarters in beautiful Lexington, Kentucky, currently about 97 degrees during the heat wave, just like the rest of you in the country. As you can see, each year we put out the 2019 strategies, management, and process solutions around the State Cio top priorities. I presented this in January 2019, not long after we released it. So I just wanted to provide a quick recap for everyone to at least give you an update about where we are and kind of do a level set. Again, the priorities remain the same through 2019. We will conduct this for 2020, late fall, probably in the early November timeframe, and so you'll see that come out again before the end of 2019. It will prognosticate 2020. But as you certainly expect, cybersecurity risk management has been number one for the last 6 years. I do not expect it to change in 2020, and it is top of mind discussion with our state CIOs and CISOs and CTOs across the country today. And we'll be addressing some of these other topics via the questions that we received during the registration process. So if we could look at the second top 10, the second top 10 are around the technologies and applications and tools, essentially what our state CIO is going to invest in. And not surprisingly, you would expect that these would map to their top strategic priorities, and you can see that. A little bit of changes in some of the rankings, but again, relatively the same that it's been for several years, particularly around legacy application modernization, legacy infrastructure modernization, Identity and access management was top 10 in terms of a management priority, and it's been on the investment list for a number of years. And we're starting to see some traction with states with statewide identity and access management solutions being deployed. And again, ERP, we're into kind of phase 3 of ERP modernization, and that really means move to the cloud on their financials and accounting and their HR systems. And of course, disaster recovery and business continuity, the DRBC discussion, which is fairly prominent in a number of states as they address the ever-challenging problem of business continuity, particularly when there are incidents. So again, that's the top 10 from a standpoint of the applications and tools, a little more granular. And if I could, I'll take one more minute, liberty of your time, to kind of talk about the address a number of the questions that we've got kind of in big buckets, and then Dale's going to take us through, and Alan and I are going to address those in maybe a little more detail. But I thought I'd give you an update just on the general state IT landscape and what we're seeing out there, kind of mid-year, mid-calendar year in July 2019. Again, continuing focus on cybersecurity with a stronger emphasis on enterprise cybersecurity models, and by that we mean the discussion around whole of state cybersecurity. Bringing in broader than just the executive branch. We've got some states that have made some fairly bold moves here just in the last couple of months. We will address the cyber talent challenges and the workforce crisis around there, about the challenges around hiring and compensation. But again, continuing emphasis on cybersecurity, particularly from a broader enterprise perspective, with emphasis obviously on the emerging threats, and we'll talk about that. CIO business models continue to evolve, and we'll talk a little bit about that too. But again, moving from this classic infrastructure only to from an owner-operator perspective to much more managed services, multi-sourcing initiatives. And our last report just about a month ago came out on our state CIO as broker playbook. So certainly look for that on our website if you're interested in this multi-sourcing initiatives and what's going on. Several questions around digital government, and I can say there tends to be right now an increased focus on user-centered design, enhancing the user experience, the UX interfaces, a focus on additional tools, a focus on more streamlined common look and feel, common portals around things like occupational and business licensing, coming together, streamlining again those experiences, just trying to do whatever they can to enhance the citizen and business experience in dealing with state government in a digital way. And certainly in terms of the access and authorization, a number of states that have now rolled out citizen identity and access management solutions, and particularly tied to things like master person index on the back end. So they only have to maintain one credential to do business with the state. And again, these are evolving, and we're going to see more of those. More interest in, we had several questions come in about artificial intelligence or robotic process automation, machine learning. And what we've seen there is, again, increasing interest. In our last report, identified that this was the top emerging technology for state CIOs. I think it gets about 60% of the interest of the vote from our state CIOs as the top emerging technology that they're going to invest in. We're seeing increasing use of chat bots on state portals. We're seeing use of bots and scripts to do administrative and clerical functions. And I think these are going to grow as we see more moving from proof of concept from pilots into actual execution. I'll talk a little bit about state IT consolidation as we get into some of the questions and the operations, but that's certainly continued with different models, more unification, some hybrid developments out there, particularly in the models around cloud deployment. We can address those. I guess finally, from just the overall landscape of the state CIO, we had 2 or 3 questions around a state CIO turnover, the dramatic turnover, and in fact, it hasn't really been as dramatic as we expected it after 22 new governors in November of 2018. As of this past week, we have 17 new state CIOs appointed, including most recently in the U.S. Virgin Islands and in Alabama. A new CIO took office in July 1st of 2019. We would have expected a little bit more. The average churn each year is around 10 to 11. So we add this on an average basis. So as we sit here in July 2019, 17 new CIOs for the year, and we might expect a couple of more, but I think it's fairly stable through the end of the calendar year. So that's my kind of quick update to take a lot of the questions and put them in kind of major overview buckets, and we're going to get to some of the more specific ones, and Dale's going to moderate us through some of those. But for right now, I'm going to turn it back over to Dale so he can bring on Alan.
Thanks, Doug. And I'd like to introduce Alan Shark, Executive Director of PTI. Hi, Alan.
Great. Hi, everyone. I thought I would follow along the lines of Doug. As you know, every January we've been doing our little state of government for state and local government. There's been kind of a question mark that's out there. Maybe there was a need to do something in between, and that's what this is: the ability to kind of recap where we are with some of the issues, and to make this a little bit more dynamic, conversational, and answer some of the questions you might have. The big news, I think we mentioned before, but now it's in full swing, is PTI is now part of CompTIA, the Computing Technology Industry Association. Although PTI maintains its mission, its brand, but we now have, I think, strength through a much larger organization that has interfaced well with NASCIO and many other organizations. So we're very, very pleased. When we look at the marketplace, I think I want to look at the spend that is involved with this, and that is, if we look at what was spent last year, combining state and local government, we're talking about $103 billion a year. This is a big market compared to the federal, which is 96. These are big dollars and real dollars. We suspect that the spend will continue. So anybody in the SLED space, and I assume that many of you are, this is significant, and this brings with it many opportunities and also many challenges. So when we look at the top 10 challenges by way of priorities in terms of our latest survey, and this will be updated at least preliminarily in November when we do our CIO Summit and Leadership Conference in Texas. Security and risk management has paralleled NASCIO year after year for, I think, at least 7, 8, 9 years. Security and risk management. I think the new word here is the risk factor, because we're using that word because I think city managers, county managers, they understand the word risk as opposed to cybersecurity issues. The word risk triggers a whole sense of legal kind of things. The second continues to be budget, cost control, fiscal management. It used to be, I think technology was sold as something that would save money. You don't hear us saying that as much anymore. It's certainly more efficient in most cases, but we don't have a choice. We have to modernize because the public expects it, whether we're actually saving money or not. Number 3 is customer relation management. Now that's kind of moved in from almost nowhere. We kind of moved in from e-government and now digital service delivery. But now it's all about the citizen or resident satisfaction. And hence we have CXs or now CXOs. We'll talk about titles, I think, in some of the questions. But this whole idea of the customer experience being more customer-centric. Consolidation, optimization continues to be an issue because everyone's playing catch-up. Not everybody is in the same place at the same time. We have something like 60,000 units of local government, not counting schools. That's big. And then we have enterprise IT, where we still trying to find ways to have digital service delivery across all lines. We call it different things as I look at the state surveys, but I think we mean the same thing. Identity and access management becomes more important. You must realize at the local level, cities and counties and townships, 40 to 60% of the workforce typically is mobile. So that means broadband becomes particularly important as identity and who has access to what. And that leads us to broadband. It's still an issue in terms of wireless connectivity. Cloud services are huge, although I like to look back and say, are we still using the word cloud, or are we talking about managed services? That's something that came up in a number of the questions. Digital government is a hot term used these days. We no longer in this country talk about e-government, although in my travels, e-government is still talked about as if it was invented yesterday. But digital services takes government services to the next level and cuts across all business lines, whether they be citizen-facing or not. And then number 10, data management and analytics. We have really progressed from open data to big data, and now we're going to talk a little bit about AI when we get to the questions. If we look at the top tech policy issues for cities and counties, I've identified a few, and I think I perhaps left one out, but autonomous vehicles still is a local issue, although I suspect we're going to see more of it in state roads before it actually enters the city ecosphere. Procurement reform is perhaps more of a wish than a policy in terms of at least getting some of the procurement people to understand the CIO and vice versa. These are two different camps. I have spoken at both, and procurement seems to still be a challenge, and I'm perhaps totally naive, but I believe that through more communication and maybe some more seminars that bring folks together, we can come up with some better guidelines that we can consider possibly for state legislation. Surveillance is huge. We're seeing for the first time both states and cities clamping down on facial recognition. So surveillance has many pieces to it in terms of policies, in terms of how long do we keep data, for what purpose, and who has access. Those are just starters. IT modernization continues to be an issue because we still have a lot of legacy equipment, and we have a lot of elected leaders and others who say, if it's working, don't fix it, without necessarily understanding the risk of not keeping up to speed. And of course, the refresh rate of equipment and software has become much quicker. And we have systems that would last 5-6 years. Now there are updates required every maybe 2 years or 3 years, which changes our funding, our procurement, and how we view stuff. Rural broadband is still a major issue for cities and counties in terms of bridging the digital divide and making sure that people outside of major metropolitan areas have an opportunity to participate in government and all the great services they offer. And then workforce development is a catch-all term that we use to basically talk about all the HR type issues, the human interface aspects, and also career paths, the difficulty of attracting and retaining good people, the exodus that continues of a lot of qualified people, and the frustration in trying to backfill some of those positions in government. Not in this list, but probably as an emerging technology would be blockchain. That's much talked about, but we're actually seeing it in use when it comes to database management in offices of deeds and records and places like that. So it's kind of like a sleeper, but it is growing. And then, of course, as Doug mentioned, this ubiquitous thing called artificial intelligence and automated processes through robots is huge, and it's real. We're already seeing chatbots conversing with citizens, not just at the state level, but also at the local government. So that's my quick overview. So I'm going to turn it back, and let's get into some of the questions and the overall topics as our folks have indicated in previous registrations.
Thanks, Alan. So as both Doug and Alan have mentioned, we kind of grouped some of the questions that we've gotten over the past couple of weeks into kind of themes or groups. So a lot around cybersecurity. So we took a couple of those and tried to merge them in. So maybe Doug, start with you to talk about the state landscape. Can you provide any updates on the overall state of IT security within state and local government? For the past few years, cybersecurity has ranked as the top issue for both NASCIO and PTI surveys of IT officials, which Alan, you just cited. And in recent months, there has been much publicity regarding ransomware attacks impacting IT. So added to this, how do you recommend getting buy-in and support and prioritizing the ever-growing and ever-needed cybersecurity initiatives, given the limited budgets and resource constraints that governments are already battling? This could probably be a whole webinar on itself.
Doug, are you on mute?
I'm going to jump back here and get off mute, Alan. Thank you, Dr. Yeah, you can't trust the technology people with these devices. Let me go back and just jump back and talk about our poll real quick, because that was interesting and kind of mirrored what we've seen. We asked the question compared to last year, what are you more or less concerned about cybersecurity incidents? 25% of the respondents said that they're more concerned. About 68% said they are equally as concerned. So you take those two together, again, you're looking at probably the cohort that we would see from a lot of the states, except for the state chief information security officers. The CISOs are clearly more concerned. And if you look at the question that Dale just answered, and give the perspectives from local government here in a minute. But clearly, we look at our data, we look at the incidents that have happened. Ransomware has kind of vaulted to the #1 position in terms of concerns and threats. This appeared on our radar several years ago in one of our surveys, and it moved up actually to the top spot in our 2018 Deloitte NASCIO cybersecurity study. Ransomware appeared for the first time as being one of the most problematic threats, along with increases in social engineering combined with, of course, phishing and farming and whaling and malware. And we're seeing kind of more of that. But certainly, I think what we're seeing right now in the public sector, ransomware, particularly in the local government, has been radically increased and problematic. I think it comes from a couple of different things. One, it's relatively easily executed. It's for the bad guys and the bad actors. It is much more. It can be monetized in terms of the criminal activity much easier than the stealing of data and the theft of data, as states and other organizations have really begun to kind of optimize their security posture and making data theft and breaches much more challenging. It seems to be easier to affect local governments, particularly with the ransomware attack. So we're going to have to address that. And there's obviously a lot of best practices out there. We've seen just this past week the mayors vote to agree on a standing policy, large U.S. cities to not pay ransom. So we're going to have to address. I'll let Alan take that one on. But I think if you look at the states, and we have 10 years on longitudinal data, we have seen a kind of a laddering maturity of the states. We see almost all states now with cybersecurity strategic plans. We see almost all states now given, and by that I mean the last survey was 98% of the states had patterned or had some type of framework that they've adopted, most predominantly the NIST cybersecurity framework. So that's what I would call the capabilities, the maturity, and the disciplines are getting increased as the threats obviously become more sophisticated, and that's one of the major challenges. So that's one of our three major themes, obviously, is dealing with the increasing sophistication of the threats. But cybersecurity we've seen has increased. We have more states, almost half of them now, that have obtained cybersecurity liability insurance. They're using advanced analytics and machine learning now to capture and analyze their logs on inbound threats. They're providing more training. So I think if you look across the board, at least on our longitudinal data, and that's from 2010 through today, we have seen increasing maturity and increasing capabilities. What we haven't seen is in major increases in investments. And so that's the major challenge states have today, is inadequate funding around cybersecurity. And I think secondarily is the talent crisis, the inability to acquire the workforce they need and to retain the existing information security professionals that they have. So that's a challenge, really, is around the funding. Funding remains relatively flat, and that's one of our advocacy pieces around that, less than 2% of IT spend. So we're going to have to address that. But certainly since even our January webcast, we've seen a pretty dramatic increase in the ransomware attacks, and successful. And so particularly at local government level. So perhaps Alan can address that from the PTI perspective.
Good, thanks, Doug. I mean, we have similar concerns, I mean, almost identical. It's just that there are more local governments, and therefore there are more targets. I grew up in a small city called Brooklyn, New York, and I remember my good parents saying, crime does not pay. And, you know, I've actually come to the conclusion that when it comes to cybercrime, it does pay, and that's really very frustrating to me. I think, to Doug's comments, yes, I have seen through our studies that people are investing more where they can. They become more sophisticated, they being CIOs and those in responsible, whether they have the title or not, because not everyone has the title of CIO, but they might have the functionality of CIO. Could be a director of IT. They have actually grown more sophisticated. The problem is the criminals have nothing else to do. And so they're always a step ahead of us. So even though one could say we have made progress overall, but not in all areas, we have a lot of catching up to do. And so, yes, we have people that don't have people who are certified. And I'm happy to say that CompTIA is the world's largest certification group, nonprofit of the security suites. But beyond that, there are a lot of things that can be done for free. I'm amazed how many local governments do not become members of MSISAC, which is part of Homeland Security, Department of Homeland Security. It's a nonprofit. They provide some monitoring services. They provide a lot of free services and some services for a fee. PTI is a sponsor. I believe NASCIO is too of MSISAC. I used to think that one of the weaknesses was they didn't have a clear message to elected leaders, because I get 2 or 3 things daily about technical bulletins and people uncovering certain vulnerabilities. I've now decided, no, that's actually good. Everybody should subscribe, become a member, and then pass those pieces of information to those who you report to, and you will be much more appreciated, because it is technical. They're going to wonder, what the heck does this all mean? And that gives you a sense to explain it, because it is technical. So we see a real problem. But here's the newest thing that concerns me about ransomware. There's nothing new here, except the ransom prices, the demands made by the bad actors, continues to go up. Even to the point of 6 figures. And for the first time, we had a city in Florida that basically held a public meeting and said, yeah, we'll pay $600,000. That's the first time it reached 3 figures. That really concerns me. And I was wondering, what in the world, is going on? And then I realized what's happening. I used to say that cyber insurance was the CIO's best friend, because to get it, we have a number of people that I know who have applied for it and did not qualify the first time, because the questionnaires require a lot of information and self-certification of things that if you were breached and it was found that you did not live up to the things that you attested to, you wouldn't be covered. So it's not easy getting cyber insurance, and it's actually getting more expensive. But in 2 cases, the insurance companies, looking at this as a business deal, said, you know what, it's cheaper for us to pay the bad guys. This is a sea shift, despite the Department of Homeland Security, despite the FBI, and now recently the U.S. Conference of Mayors. Suddenly we have insurance companies that are saying, oh yeah, it's cheaper for us to pay it. And that scares me, because it's only going to encourage bad behavior and make things worse for all of us. So I'm concerned about training. We still have too many CIOs who say, well, they won't give me the money to train out of state. They won't give me the money to really have an ongoing cyber awareness program for employees. Not something once a year, but ongoing. So training is a big weakness to this day. The idea of monitoring still becomes to some a luxury. I wish I had it. And the bottom line is that just working as best we can, or I'm working my tail off, is no longer adequate. We've got to actually put a line in the sand and say, we have to have these things. We can no longer assure the security that is necessary to protect public trust in all the information we have. I think we're in a crisis, and I think many local governments don't have the capabilities. They have the desire, but they don't have the capability, and they need external help.
Now, good points, Alan, particularly around your point about communications is important. We talk a lot about, obviously the importance of overall governance from the enterprise perspective, and we see that. I mentioned that on my opening remarks, and we see that growing in terms of the governance. I think communication, as you mentioned, is critical, particularly to executive leadership, to legislators, and again, we ask those questions a lot in terms of where are you in terms of your common messaging, and I think that's important that you have that common messaging around that. And part of this is simply the cultural shift and some of the demands and mandates that perhaps CIOs and state CISOs may put for their executive branch agencies can cause some pushback, can cause some challenges. And I think we're constantly reminding them that communicating the discussion around that cybersecurity is a business risk. It's a business risk to states. It's not simply in the technology domain. And I think that helps at least legislators and executive folks understand this. You're right, though. This is going to continue. It's not a project. It's something that we have to live with as part of the digital world. And that's challenging when you're trying to communicate that to appointees and elected officials. You got some more questions for us, Dale?
Yeah, so we've got several that we kind of grouped into the category of operations. So a couple around cloud. So here's one. Cloud services has been a popular topic for the past few years. I would be interested in learning about any obstacles that state and local governments are currently facing with regards to moving more of their daily activities to cloud-based systems.
Well, I think it has become easier for states to do that, but there are clearly some barriers and obstacles. One of that is simply for the agencies anyway, is what's their governance model, and by that I mean is the movement to cloud essentially orchestrated or mandated? And we've seen just recently with some legislation, and I saw another question around the specific legislation mandating that state government move to the cloud. I think that's probably a little bit premature. I don't think the legislature should weigh in on defining the business architecture of state solutions. But we've certainly seen evolving what I'll call governance or just the models around how cloud should be deployed. How should it be procured? How should it be acquired and adopted? And part of that is, kind of a central, is we have half the states which are using kind of a cloud broker concept where the use of cloud is again orchestrated and worked through the CIO office, so that you don't have a multitude of cloud solutions. You want to really strike the kind of the balance here and have enterprise solutions. So I think that's what we're going to see evolving across the states, is where their cloud services from a private cloud perspective, meaning those provided by state government, are again traditionally been centralized within the CI organization. But cloud states are now moving, and state CIOs are now moving to more public cloud and what I'll call third-party off-premise cloud solutions provided by the vendor community. So you have to have some type of structure to that. We do have a number of states that basically are kind of carte blanche. They let the individual agencies make those decisions. But I think that's right now a relatively small number for the state. Some of the states that are federated or decentralized. I think we're going to see the cloud adoption moving in the more of a hybrid model, and one where there's kind of a central governance. And then part of that is, I think one of the challenges around that states have faced, one is around just making the business case because of legacy modernization. Some applications are just not suitable to move to the cloud environment today. So you have to make decisions. Some states have called it, kind of the cloud smart model of the federal government rather than cloud first. And I think the other piece is procurement. And this has been talked about. That's why I think if you see states go into the broker model, where they've essentially pre-qualified and then selected a group of qualified sourcing providers from the private companies that'll be their cloud providers, and the agencies get to pick among, again, a brokered solution rather than simply being tied into one. So I think states are going to have some more flexibility in that. Security used to be number one. Concerns about security a few years ago was the number one barrier to cloud adoption, and I think it's been demonstrated that, in fact, most of the particularly off-premise and third-party cloud solutions, their security and those that are FedRAMP certified are actually probably more secure than what we're seeing in some of the state data centers. So that has been less of a concern in the last 4 or 5 years.
Alan, do you want anything to add?
Yeah. I think what Doug said at the end there is really important in terms of FedRAMP. A lot of people are not familiar with that at the local government level, but this is an ongoing process with GSA and the Fed certifying, and it's a rather strenuous process to be certified to be a cloud provider. Our issues are a little different because, again, we have so many smaller local governments. I think we did a survey about 7 or 8 years ago, and 99% of our CIOs said, no way. We don't think there's enough security to protect our data. It's against the law. And I think both of those things are gone. I totally agree with Doug. And what the research shows is now show me the way. And it really depends on what Doug alluded to. Where are you in the life cycle of your infrastructure? If you just invested in a new data center, then putting everything in the cloud makes absolutely no sense. But if you are at a point where you're reaching end of life on a mainframe, those who still have them, and other kinds of equipment, then it's a good time to just step back, take an assessment, and take a look at, what are the options. But the idea of cloud is too general to me, because it's like, do we put applications in the cloud? Are we just putting data in the cloud? Is it a combination of both? Is it a private cloud? Is it a public cloud? I've identified something like 6 different models anywhere from managed services of everything, where the CI becomes a contract officer or performance officer, to picking and choosing. In many local governments, you have parks and recreation, and they're dealing with an app that is in the cloud. A city may actually, or county may have email in the cloud. So there are many little applications. I always say do the low-hanging fruit first. And in places where you have a more of a federated approach to technology, which seems to be a preferred model moving forward, as opposed to vesting everything in just one central location, except for the most important forms of data. That's a trend, whether it's good or not. So I think cloud will continue, especially when it's hard for people to find the talent that is needed. It's a matter of scale. Does everybody have to own their own pieces of equipment, or does it make sense to kind of have kind of a condominium of data, whether it be through a county or working with the state? I am for those collaborative models, but it is about scale. What makes more sense? We're seeing that in policing and fire and all that. Does everybody have to own their own stuff? In today's world, the answer is no. But we have to manage it, and you can never delegate responsibility. So it doesn't mean that because you're doing it that you're scot-free, don't have to worry about it. No, you do. But maybe you'll have less to worry about because now you have a different model that might provide you better kinds of security.
Yeah, and I
Thank
think the
you.
collaboration piece is a good point too, because I know that is an area we can probably touch on, is growing interest, particularly on the cloud side, of local governments taking advantage of state scale. And again, it may be on-prem private cloud that the state makes available, but I think evolving is going to be much more. The state's going to take advantage of managed cloud providers and managed services for particular solutions, and they may in fact be able to be rolled out to local governments. So we're going to have some data with our 2019 survey. We've asked a number of questions of our state CIOs around state-local collaboration. What services are they providing? What are the predominant services they're providing? What kind of business models do they have? Are they involving local governments? So stay tuned for that. We'll have that data in October when we get through some of the analysis of that to look at. I think what we have certainly assumed is an expanding portfolio of state and local interactions. And I know you and I have talked about this a lot about, why can't there be more of this? And I think with the stress and the financial concerns of local governments, we are going to see more of this, particularly in sharing of infrastructure, co-location, et cetera.
Thank you. I'm going to skip ahead just a little bit because we are getting questions that are coming in live. So kind of like underneath the management bucket, there's a question. What are some of the trends or best practices that you are seeing for getting IT organizations and top executives, not just IT, to think and act with an enterprise focus versus a focus on silos?
The never-ending question, never-ending question about the enterprise view. Well, I think, again, we're probably seeing some of this as well in the local. I think one is I would call the broad governance discussion about having broad governance discussions. By that I mean having some type of organization which does not include or may specifically exclude the information technology or the technology leadership. By that I mean the CIOs or the IT directors of the agencies, and have more of a governance model, which some term the investment review board or IT investment board, where you actually have the business owners and the stakeholders of the lines of business in the agencies, the transportation and health department and human services and labor and education, that they are actually looking at some of the business problems across the board and looking at those common solutions. So I think that is under the major umbrella. So I would say look at one of the major trends is around product and portfolio management, and we see a number of states that have taken that on, where they're looking at portfolio management. By this I mean across the enterprise, across the executive branch of state government. I think the other is the adoption of business disciplines, things like IT service management, ITSM, and most recently in the past few years, the technology business management. So TBM and now is kind of got a foothold in a number of states. It's still really nascent. We have some states that have a lot of experience in that. So that's bringing in both the financial and the budget folks into conversations around what are you investing in? Do you have metrics around that? Making wise decisions because, again, predominantly the state CIOs are still in a cost recovery or chargeback business. They're a central organization and they're billing their state agencies, so they need to continue to have that enterprise view. So I think we're going to see more of that from a management perspective, bringing more disciplines in and growing that a cadre of folks, particularly as states move to more of a CIO as broker, or again less of an owner operator and much more in the contract. They're going to have more information around what they're investing in at a portfolio level, and they're going to have to hire more contract managers and folks who can manage the relationships with the individual agencies.
So I may have a different take, although complementary, because the experiences are different at the local level. I think the forces that I see are about moving towards digital service delivery, where everyone's trying to figure out a more customer-centric experience. And I think most would agree that the local government is the place where most people first identify, other than driver's license and other things. I mean, all levels of government are important, but they have different levels of interaction with citizens. So in this case, the customer experience movement is causing people to look more enterprise-wide, like 311 systems and things that bring people together so that they can solve common problems. From the customer experience, ERP is the second pressure that's causing people to look for enterprise-wide resource planning. I mean, that's kind of a weird term, but essentially, as people go through new ERPs every so often, allows people to look at all the different systems so that a centralized database can be better utilized to be able to have access to different forms of data and information across lines, taking payments and the like. That is moving it. The cloud is another part of that. And then I think the professionalization of the CIO at the local level is also moving. We have 4 universities. PTI works with Rutgers on 1 of 4, where we're offering certified CIO certifications and digital service professional certifications. We are really seeing a desire to elevate the role of these folks where it's more the business side than the technology side as it used to be. So now I think those who are hiring people are looking more for emotional intelligence, they're looking for business development skills, collaboration skills. This is unheard of when we look at the origins of technology in local government. So the elevation of the CIO is helping to be at the table, to be able to provide input on how technology can support the various lines of business. And then finally, it's going to require top-down insistence from city and county managers who see the benefit of a more unified approach. And I start to see that happening. Part of that was spurred on by the smart city county movement, which looked for holistic type of solutions. And if there's anything good about that movement, it is a different way of managing, and we fully support that.
Alan, do you see the same challenges? I think it's a microcosm of what the states are seeing, which is a real challenge around the role of the individual agency and the IT directors and CIOs. There's clearly a lot of, again, relationship management that has to take place, particularly as we see more consolidation and unification. You've got the same challenge in local governments because that, from the political standpoint, from the city manager, from the council, from the county supervisors, they believe the role of that local government CIO is to run the stuff. They're willing to look at that and say, we're no longer capable, we don't have the financial resources, we should either outsource this or we need to jettison and maybe move, as we've seen growing co-location and data center hosting agreements with states. We have a number of large locals that are doing that. Is that something that we got to be concerned about?
Yeah, I mean, I see everything that's negative to also be a positive or a potential positive. I think the Great Recession of 2008 really forced local governments to think differently, utilizing less people, leveraging what they had with other groups. It forced people to be more creative than they would have been on their own. So, what's really interesting is I think many localities have recovered financially from 2008, but they're not spending as if they've recovered. So, this push to become more innovative continues. And again, I want to say something. The word innovation hasn't crept into our discussion yet. Innovation is a very misunderstood term. It really is about developing new ways to do the same old thing, not necessarily inventing something new, but a new process. And it may or may not be supported by technology. So, yeah, I think scarce resources makes people very creative.
All right. Dale,
Thank
what
you.
do
And
we
maybe
got for?
and maybe Alan, starting with you, because you kind of touched on it in your opening remarks, and you touched on it in just on the previous question around IT workforce. Here's a question. I am wondering if you can touch on some of the IT workforce issues that governments will be dealing with in the coming years, if not months. For example, in our IT organization, we are preparing for a silver tsunami, the retirement of almost one-third of our staff within the next 16 months.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because other places have already experienced that. And yeah, there's a mass exodus of people who during the recession actually stayed longer because the uncertainty was so great that they stayed maybe a year or two. Now, suddenly, with the stock market being higher and therefore their perceived retirement benefits looking better, yeah, all these delayed retirements are happening all at once in an accelerated fashion. Secondly, it is harder to backfill for these positions because you have a new group of folks coming in with different values. I'm not saying bad, it's just different. In a year or two, millennials will actually inherit the majority of the workforce. They do not typically stay as long in any position. And so governments have to be prepared for more, I guess, less tenure for folks. What is a new expectation? Is it 3 years? Are we going to be happy with 5 years? Is this an opportunity to outsource more? Because now suddenly you might be able to get through scale the caliber of people you may not be able to afford on your own. But this is a real issue. And secondly, our organizations are becoming very flat. Doug and I were talking about this before. Everyone's a chief. We have chief information officers, chief knowledge officers, chief data officers. We have CISOs. These are relatively new positions. Now we have chief customer experience officers. And what makes things frustrating is they report to different people. Now, I always believe that the foundation of wisdom, this is a classic pyramid, has always been data. But data is useless unless it's turned into information, hence the chief information officer. But once you have information, you actually build knowledge from information. And then from there, through analytics and through other means, and then finally you have wisdom. That whole chain has been somewhat broken. So we have some real challenges of a flat organization, and when somebody is not there, the position is vacant, that job is not being performed. That's kind of new. We always had some kind of depth of bench where someone else could fill in. We see less of that. It's harder to retain people, and governments are not paying more, and they should. So the two things that I've always said is governments should look at not treating everybody the same, which is a very civil service type mentality, and recognize, like the federal government is doing, if you have a position that is hard to fill because of the marketability of that position, governments need to rethink their civil service rules and say we need to find stipends or some other way to compensate them, either through benefits, time off, or something that will attract the talent that is absolutely required. The second thing is we need to get away from these horrible classifications that are confused with titles. I cannot tell you how many times I ask somebody, well, okay, so this person is a tech 3 and they're at the fourth quadrant of their salary line. Does that mean they have to be called that? And the answer is all too often, yes. And I'm saying, no, give them a title commensurate with their responsibility. That goes a long way towards quality of life, career development. And if you can't pay them, give them recognition. Don't walk around saying, well, we have to keep them as tech 3 on their business cards. government's got to modernize their HR system, not just their technology. It's very frustrating to me because the things I just mentioned do not cost a penny.
Yeah, and Alan, that aligns with, we've actually collected this data in terms of, and we'll be collecting again in 19. We looked at asking state CIOs what would be, in terms of kind of modernizing the environment, as you said, the HR, in terms of, what kind of personnel reform would be implemented that would have the most impact. And number one last year, and I suspect it'll be number one again in 2019, is modernizing the IT class and comp. So modernizing those classifications where you're trying to post and pray for a position for data processing specialist 3, which was created in 1971, and you haven't modernized that. So we have some states that have done that, including California in 18, that have major set of reforms around their IT classifications, broadbanded, and also reformed a lot of their titles. So it can be done. California took it on because they realized that it makes them non-competitive. And I think the other thing is providing a flexible work environment, a workspace, a work week. That's what people want. So those are a couple of things that we saw. Additional training was number 3. So providing training to build skills. We see states like Tennessee that put in Trading Academy and others. So there are examples out there of states that are building it. I think the second component of that is what you mentioned is, how do you attract and attain? Because it's not going to be through compensation. So it may be through a flexible work environment, and what I think, quite frankly, the CIOs see as the greatest opportunity is provide a challenging work environment. You may get to do more cool stuff. They're going to use the call to public service as one of their anchors to be able to bring people in, because they know they can't bring them in through their compensation. So streamlining the process helped, but I think the call to public service and just trying to promote some of those non-salary benefits. And obviously, we used to laugh. People said, "How do you attract good IT talent to state government? You hide in the bushes and you make a noise like a benefit." Well, that doesn't work anymore because the benefits are not as lucrative as they once were. Many states have, obviously moving away from defined pensions. They've lowered their benefit scale to a degree where that doesn't make them any different than the rest of the marketplace. So I think states have a challenge. We're looking at some of the data from some of the states, and again, this is not national data, but I've looked at a number of states over the last few weeks, and across the boards, the ones that actually publish demographic data from various departments, and I'm looking at an average age of about 51 for the IT departments for major states that I looked at. That was what they published as average age. Talked to a CIO just a couple of weeks ago, said they only had 2 employees in his department of over 600 people, only 2 employees under 30. So obviously that has to change. So talent, workforce, human capital management are major issues that have to be addressed for government to be successful. And state government, like local government, is shrinking actually. So less employees today than in 2008. I have a lot to say about that.
I would add to that the need for more women in technology leadership positions. CompTIA is actually investing because, the industry part of what they do is investing heavily in attracting young people to go into technology. And for the first time, we're seeing a decline of women going into technology because they think it's a man's world. It's not, and it shouldn't be anymore. And so we're trying to do everything we can to encourage more women to move up the ranks. There's plenty of women in technology, but not in leadership positions. So, we're committed in our end as our association and our larger group to attract more folks, more minorities, to give them the chance to be part of that. So I think that's good news for those groups looking for a better career.
And I would echo that and say it's particularly problematic and acute in the cybersecurity and information security space. We have some excellent state chief information security officers that we just met with them last week. I think we now have 5 or 6 women in those positions, but that's certainly not enough. And there's been evidence, and in fact, some research around diversity in the cybersecurity field is actually beneficial, I think overall it's only about 11%. So we need to bring more women into the cybersecurity space because they bring actually some different perspectives and skill sets. And again, with the research around the importance of having a diverse set of thinking and kind of wisdom of the crowds with that in cybersecurity, it's actually beneficial in terms of reducing the risk. So that's something we should be focused on.
Well, we've got about 5 minutes left in the conversation. So what I thought is maybe end on kind of a future kind of theme. And then, after this, and then you could each make some kind of closing remarks. When thinking about emerging technologies, what do you see as having the potential to have most impact on government services in the future? For example, we talked a little bit about artificial intelligence, and it's a buzzword right now in the private sector. Is it the same for the public sector? And how can AI impact government services? Alan, did you want to start?
Yeah, from the state side, we actually have some pretty good empirical data on this, at least from the CIO perspective, and we're certainly seeing it within our other state associations and the folks that I communicate with. A couple of years ago, artificial intelligence, which again is a buzzword, I would say, the intelligent automation, augmented intelligence, robotic process automation, machine learning, bots, chat bots. So put that as all under clearly varying levels from relatively easy to deploy and consumer grade up to pure artificial intelligence, cognitive computing. That big bucket has kind of moved up into the #1 spot from the CIO perspective. I think because of the impact on business, but more importantly because of the ability to enhance experiences with the citizens. If you ask them what's the major benefit around adoption, they're gonna tell you it's probably about improving that citizen experience and providing them with a meaningful interaction. We're seeing that with a number of states that have deployed chatbots on their web portal, several states that are now using digital assistants to augment the citizen experience. So they've introduced Alexa to be able to interact with states like Utah and Mississippi, and others now have Alexa skills built in. So I think you're going to see that. And if you look at the data that we have around the adoption, artificial intelligence as that broad categories, I just mentioned some of the subsets, about 60% or so of our CIOs say they see that as the most impactful emerging technology over the next 2 to 3 years, meaning, again, enhanced productivity, efficiency. They don't believe there's going to be a huge impact on workforce reduction. I think they see it augmenting mundane tasks and transferring those perhaps to a scripted bot. We've seen that in states where they're using those and doing things like financial reconciliations overnight and allowing then the financial clerks and others to do more important and value-laden work. So I think that's where we're going to see this move, at least initially, is not going to be substituting for the workforce, but enhancing or augmenting the workforce with some skills. So right now, if you look at adoption based on data, which is about 6 months old from us, we've got about a quarter of the states, about 25% of the states said they have AI in production. And most of those, I would say, would be robotic process automation. So those would be, again, taking basically bot script and being able to use that for existing business processes. And about another 25%, another quarter, said that they're in some kind of pilot or test mode. So right now we've got about half the states that are actively involved beyond simply discussion and proof of concept. And I would say most of those, if not all of them, are going to be outside of the CIO organization. They're going to be in lines of business, in tax and revenue, finance. Clearly we see it in HR, screening applications and things like that. So that's where the states are right now. IoT is now dropped down into the #2 slot, and then unmanned aerial systems and drones around there. I think you're going to see the local government be a little bit different. Alan, what do you think?
Yeah, I'm obviously fascinated with artificial intelligence. In fact, Doug and I both sit as fellows of the National Academy for Public Administration, and I can shamelessly show you this publication. It's free, downloadable, called
plug,
AI. I'm sorry?
A blatant plug. I should hold up some of our reports here.
Oh, I'm going to talk about your report and its impact on public administration. But I guess my point is the #1 thing is going to be digital service delivery. I think local governments are still trying to figure out better ways for the customer experience, which leads to greater trust at a time when trust is at an all-time low. So to me, digital service delivery encompasses so much, bringing things together. Number two would be AI, because AI sits on top of data. Data brings it to life. And so when it comes to cybersecurity, having AI looking at logs and looking for anomalies, as Doug says, which is so important, AI is a exploded term that is way too general, like cloud computing. But if that's what gets us the funding and the interest, I'm all for it. But essentially, it is augmented decision making, it is improvements in business processes, it's true innovation, but it sits on data. So, we've moved from open data to big data, and now this technology brings all these buckets together and makes more sense of things at a speed which no human could possibly compete with, and give us information that we could never have before. I agree with Doug. I don't think it's going to replace us in this field, in government, but it will make us a lot, I think, better decision makers when we look at what the data suggests and tells us, assuming the data in is adequate. We've had some examples where it hasn't been, so we have to really look at the quality of data. But the centerpiece of everything is AI moving forward.
And I think I would reinforce and end with, if you're talking about that future, those are two considerations. One is around the quality of data, and we know in public institutions, just like private, there's a high percentage of data that is of poor quality and needs to be addressed. You just can't simply ingest that from an AI engine. And I think the other challenge is, as you mentioned, the appropriate use, and I think AI ethics. How are the algorithms constructed? Is there bias? And I think that's what states are going to have to address, and any public sector organization. So there's a lot of good work going on around AI research. So I certainly would certainly recommend that you get the National Academy piece, because that's very good. Addresses what I would call kind of the policy dimensions of important to look at, because you can buy stuff relatively easily today, but you can't address some of the other challenges that you might have.
So I did a shameless thing for the National Academy. It's not a PTI publication. Just go to napawash.org. But I do want to say that I think NASCIO has one of the best libraries of information you can download. So I can say, quite honestly, we use it. I use it in my classes. They've had Capital in the Cloud series for years. Their studies, their information, all downloadable. If you have not looked at their inventory of what they have on their website, I really encourage you. A lot of what's been mentioned, you can find on their website. So I think both organizations are very proud of the information that we turn out. We're proud of our relationship working together for all these years. So hopefully we can have more of these dialogues, and we definitely will be back with you in January when we have new data, new information to share with you about the latest survey.
Yeah. Yes, thank you, Alan, for the kind remarks, and we're to 2020. Again, this is NASCIO's 50th anniversary. I know PTI is almost as old. They've been around for, how many years now?
46.
6. I knew it was close. So NASCIO's 50th anniversary. So we are celebrating 1969 moon landing, as well as the founding of National Association of State CIOs. So we look forward to our annual conference coming up in October. We were kind of end that major celebration for 2019. So appreciate your kind attendance today, and we had a lot of folks. I know we couldn't get to nearly half the questions that we had in front of us, but we'll look at repeating this format, because we had a high demand, obviously, for addressing a lot of these questions, Alan.
Great. All right. Well, thanks, everybody. Thank you, Doug.
Back to you, I guess.
Well, thank you very much. And I just wanted to say, as Doug mentioned, we did not get a chance to get to all the questions, so we apologize for that. And maybe we should think about scheduling a part 2 of the conversation. But just a reminder that the webinar is being recorded, so everyone will receive within the next 24 hours a link to the recording. So thank you very much, Alan and Doug. Thank you, everyone, for attending, and try to stay cool this afternoon. Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye.